So last week on the Folklore Tree, we talked a little bit about the history of folklore as it developed in the United Kingdom. This week, we're going to be shifting our focus across the pond to the United States of America. This is going to be the last video that I talk exclusively about history. It'll pop up now and again as we delve into other topics, but by the end of this video, we will still have barely scratched the surface of the history of folklore as it develops into a viable academic field. I'm also going to be doing a bit more name dropping in this one, but don't worry, it won't be on the test. Or will it? As you may remember from last week, people have been studying folklore in what we now know as the United Kingdom since the term was first coined in the mid-19th century. However, the study wasn't introduced to the US until 1887 when Lee J. Vance first published his article Folklore Studies in Open Court magazine, which was read by professional academics and middle-class enthusiasts alike. In addition to introducing American readers to the idea of studying folklore, Vance also encouraged them to begin collecting folklore in much the same way that scholars in England were collecting folklore, so that certain aspects of folk culture could be preserved. Now, initially, folkloric study in the US followed many of the same patterns as its English counterparts, namely in that the focus tended to revolve around studying the backwards or antiquarian culture of rural-dwelling people. In 19th century America, this generally meant First Nations people, or Southern blacks. Their term, not mine. Occasionally venturing across the American border to French-speaking Canada or Spanish-speaking Mexico. However, it is also in early American folklore studies that you begin to see greater inclusivity. Folklorist John Watson, no, not that John Watson, John Fanning Watson, studied everything from changing food prices to witchcraft trials. Another early American folklorist, Oliver T. Mason, was one of the first to start noticing the similarities in social structure between folk culture, elite culture, and middle-class culture, which were considered very separate at the time. As Mason once wrote, "Everything we have, they have. They are the back numbers of us." Let's go to the whiteboard. Inspired not only by the work of folklorists in the UK and continental Europe, but by scholars from a variety of disciplines, American folklorists decided to further their studies and share their work by establishing learned societies. Perhaps the biggest and most influential was the American Folklore Society, or AFS for short, which was established in 1888 and is still running today. Link in the description. The first president of the AFS was Harvard professor Francis James Child. Child is most famous for his work on traditional ballads, namely the ones we know today as child ballads. Though Child and his followers were primarily interested in the literary side of things, the AFS also strived to include, and often preferred, a more anthropological approach to folklore studies. Thus, the AFS helped shape the sometimes English literature, sometimes anthropology sort of approach that often characterizes folklore as a discipline. Probably helped that several popular American authors were also part of the AFS, like Mark Twain, Joel Chandler Harris, and Edward Eggleston. The American Folklore Society, not just for academics. I also mentioned earlier that early folklorists also borrowed academic techniques from other disciplines, ranging from the humanities to the sciences. In fact, the way that folklorists approached their work also started to change when a very famous scholar made an important discovery and proposed a shiny new theory that changed the world. And it might not be one that you expected. Plot twist, it's Charles Darwin and his theory of evolution by natural selection. However, folklorists applied Darwin's theory in terms of the cultural rather than the biological in order to track how we progressed from a so-called savage culture to the civilized culture of the middle and upper classes. Hey, I said folklore got to be more inclusive when it moved to the United States. I didn't say it was entirely egalitarian. That was a much more 20th century development. Now, when it comes to the history of folklore as an academic field of study, we have barely dabbled our toes in the water. We've talked a little bit about its development in the UK and the US, but we haven't even talked about how it's developed in Canada or continental Europe or any other countries for that matter. If I was going to cover any more of folklore's history, I'd have to start a whole other channel. There's just too much to cover, and I'm sure you guys are getting as excited as I am to actually be able to dig into the meat of really studying folklore. That or you're all asleep and I'm just a really terrible history teacher. At least try to rouse yourselves for next week when I'm going to tell you everything you need to know about folk groups. And I'm not talking about Peter, Paul, and Mary. Have a great week, and I'll see you guys next time.